It's been a hot minute since we last checked in on what was going on over at National Allied. The small company is still struggling, it seems. New Comics is a bi-monthly title for just the first half of 1936, and, like More Fun, it still isn't all in color. It's still a 64-page anthology with 24 features ranging from 1 to 4 pages long, and they run the gamut from cartoon gags to literary adaptations to adventure. I've already mentioned Federal Men, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster's third feature, but delayed looking ahead past the debut story until now. Jerry and Joe were feeling very confident about Federal Men. They thought that this was going to be their breakout success. Why do I say that? Because it's the only feature they were actively promoting themselves. With their second story, they promised free art to the fan who wrote the best fan letter. In the fourth appearance of Federal Men, they advertised a junior Federal Men club that young readers could join. They would send in $1 and get a badge or something. And then the Junior Federal Men Club started being pushed in stories themselves, with fictional club members helping the star of Federal Men, Agent Steve Carson of the FBI. The precedent for this should be obvious. Little Orphan Annie, or more specifically her radio show, had the Radio Orphan Annie Secret Society, complete with its famous decoder ring. The radio show had 6 million regular listeners, though I haven't been able to identify how many of them were secret society members. Regardless, you can follow the associations to their not quite logical but certainly hoped for conclusions. If a popular radio program has a special fan club, then something else with a special fan club must also be popular too, right? But why did they think Federal Men would be the breakout feature? It couldn't be for Steve Carson. Steve Carson, Stanley Keene, and even Dr. Colt all look and sound interchangeable. Heck, so could Henri Duval if he just shaved his mustache and started wearing modern clothes. None of them have backstory that explains how they became the people they are or what makes them special. It was surely deliberate. Given only 1 to 4 pages of space a month, you can't waste even a panel on superfluous information you don't need for the story. But perhaps it was also deliberate because the hero is meant to just be a cipher that the reader experiences the story through, instead of experiencing the story to get the character. So, what makes Federal Men different? The first installment felt very police procedural, not all that different from what you might expect Sandy Keene to be doing in Calling All Cars. But there is definitely a ratcheting up of action and the stakes. In his second story, Steve foils a mid-air assassination plot that requires him to leap between planes. In his third adventure, a two-parter over consecutive issues, he thwarts a plan to assassinate the president when he discovers the submarine they plan to launch the attack from. How do you top that? An impossibly gigantic 5-story tank rolling into Washington, D.C. to crush our nation's capital. That's right, the secret to this strip was going to be science fiction. You may recall I said before that Siegel and Shuster loved science fiction above all else. It was what they spent the majority of their hard-earned money on and dedicated their fanzine to. They assumed every kid out there felt the same, and this was going to be the secret ingredient that made Federal Men their ticket to the big time. Science fiction, of course, is what they think they're writing. As DJ Dayton wrote on his blog, Babblings About DC Comics 10 years ago, Siegel and Shuster are taking the strip away from the world of the FBI and forcing it toward the superhero universe that they are chomping at the bit to create. And I concur. Only Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson, their publisher and editor, didn't seem to quite feel as so enthusiastic. Despite strong initial feedback on Don Drake and Super Police 2023, science fiction wasn't doing too well over in More Fun Comics. The closest thing to science fiction in new comics had been the short-lived Strange Adventures of Mr. Weed, and that had used the science fiction for comedy only. He was less convinced than Jerry and Joe that this was going to be a success, and we know this because he never gave Federal Men the coveted cover spot or even prime real estate inside the book, tucking it with all the rest of the filler in the middle. So what then did Malcolm think was going to sell in new comics? You wouldn't know by the cover since they're featuring generic characters not featured in any inside stories. It's possible that Malcolm just didn't know it was going to work at this point, but was willing to turn the covers over to his associate editor, Vince Sullivan. Vin was drawing Spike Spaulding and Charlie Fish, still over in More Fun, two features I've talked about or at least mentioned in the past, neither of which was setting the comic book world on fire. In New Comics, Vin was writing another cartoony feature called Jibby Jones. If there is a Charlie Fish or Jibby Jones fan out there anywhere in the world watching this, I would love to hear from you. Vin Sullivan may not have been, well, very good, but he was prolific. By 1937, he would be writing almost half of the stories published under Wheeler Nicholson, and not just the cartoony features, for better or for worse. Now, if we look to the first lot in the book, there are several tryouts for this prime real estate, but by midway through 1936, it looked like Captain Bill of the Texas Rangers, which debuted in issue number 2, was going to be the regular first feature. And this would have made sense to Malcolm. Jerry and Joe were practically still kids. Captain Bill was the work of Bill Allison, a man with, granted, no comic strip experience, but he had done advertising art since the 1920s. Captain Bill lasted 2 issues, until the next issue when it became Captain Jim, and that was what stuck, and it was also the work of a different artist, Homer Fleming, this time an old hand at comic strips. Although one would never know it, his previous claim to fame, if it can be called that, was a strip called Craig Kennedy, which nobody remembers, and he did that way back in the 20s. But that didn't daunt Malcolm. He trusted experience. Although the feature was named after the Texas Ranger, the real stars of the strip were Johnny and Jane, two kids working on a ranch in Texas who discover the identity of a train robber and spend a lot of page count just trying to dodge the bad guys and reach Captain Jim to let him know. Jim is so immaterial to the plot in most installments that it didn't really matter if his name was Bill or Jim or whatever. Although Homer Fleming will continue to work in comic books until 1950, Captain Jim, or Captain Bill, Captain Bill Jim, lasts only until the 27th issue of what by then will be called New Adventure Comics. More about that in a future episode. And speaking of episodes, make sure that you like and subscribe to this episode so I'll know to continue making more. Thanks and bye for now.